And so you might differ in what I'm suggesting, but I'm giving you this presentation from the lens of an editor, of a referee, and a supervisor. So my take on how to write a paper and presenting papers, it might be different, but this is the way I see it. And when I see manuscripts and papers landing on my desk, this is the way I judge about those papers, okay? So I'm going to make this presentation 40 minutes, and you see why. So can I switch instead of you guys doing it? Okay. So here's the things I want to talk about first. I want to talk about very general stuff for 3 slides, and then I get into details about each section. Okay? So there's things I like to state right away. So when I see a paper, I like to see 4 things. I like to see the objective of the paper, which a paper is doing right away. And I like to see what the issues are. I like to see what the motivation for this paper is. Why is your work interesting? Okay, that's what I want to see. I want to see whether your paper is different in terms of empirical works, whether it's a different theory. Is there something new in this paper? That's what I want to see. And I also like to see what framework are you working on. So I like to see empirical framework, I like to see a theoretical framework, but I want to see how you go about doing this type of stuff. And then lastly, I like to see what are you contributing to this literature. If you're just writing things because it's interesting, doesn't make any contribution to the literature at all. So I like to see these 4 things right away. Again, there's so when we start off doing our research in PhD period, we have lots and lots of ideas. We think we know everything. We read a lot, and we want to express everything in what we have learned in one paper. And that's not how you should go about it. So my supervisors in Chicago, they always told me, you have one idea, you write 3 papers. Whereas a lot of PhD students and young researchers, what they do is they have 1,000 ideas and write in 1 paper. The reason I say this is because whenever I see a paper landing on my desk, I want to be focused on one particular idea, and when I get 3, 4 different ideas in one paper, I have no idea. I lose interest in reading this paper and having a good positive outlook on this paper. So your goal is to make your audience interested in what you're doing. Okay? So if you lose referee's interest in the first 10 seconds, you have no chance of getting that paper in any journal, regardless how great that paper is. Okay? So when I see a paper or manuscript, I could tell within 10 seconds whether I'm going to like this paper, that I'm going to decide whether I'm going to further read on the next page. Okay? So as soon as I see something is very complicated, lots of ideas, without any reason, I'm just going to say, I'm not going to read this. So you're fighting against, this referee's negative perspective on your paper. And that's not how you should start. Always start simple, okay? The way you want to make your paper really simple, understandable, is you write, first version will be like 100 pages long. I know. Because you want to express every little detail, every little theory, every little equations. But write that's okay. But try writing it down, cutting it down as smaller and smaller and smaller. And if you can write your whole paper in 1 paragraph, you're doing a great job. Try doing that exercise all the time. Okay? And it's really, really hard for your supervisors, referees, to read the whole paper in detail because we don't have the time. Tell you the truth, I don't have the time to read whole your paper in detail, every one that comes through. But if I read a paragraph, which I talk about, that interests me, that I didn't see it before, then I'll read it. I'll read the whole paper, okay? And what you want to do is, you want to make these results very simple as possible so that anyone can understand what's going on. Moreover, the last, what I suggest is you never want to put the punchline at the end of the paper or whatever. You want to make that punchline your main result as soon as possible right there. Okay, so here's the thing, general comments. So you always want to relate why you're doing this, how is that related to the rest of the literature. And you don't have to talk about a whole bunch of other stuff. Just write simple sentences, things like, my paper is related to this, okay? And my contribution is this. Instead of going about many different paragraphs, why is this interesting, why is this important, who cares? I don't care as a referee, I don't care as an editor, how is this interesting? You don't have to tell me, you have to let the referee decide whether this is interesting or not. You should never say it's interesting to you, otherwise you're not going to write this paper. But the point is, you want your papers to be published in the journal, to get accepted. You want to make sure the referees understand what you're doing, okay? And do not say things like something is that, this is a basic idea about positive versus normative way of thinking in terms of writing, right? You always want to put normative stuff, numbers, facts, and not your opinion about things. Unless it's a policy paper, you might want to address some stuff. But mostly, you do not want to include anything about this is better than something else. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start off with the title. I'm going to then go into abstract, and then I'm going to get into empirical section, and so on and so forth. At the end of the talk, I want to talk a couple of slides about how you should present. Because this is a conference, I take some hints about how do you present during a conference. So I'm talking in terms of referee or editor. I hate long titles. Your title should be short, but should have all the information that you think that's going to reflect on your in your paper. Okay. And you should never put a very general title. You don't want to put things like 3 essays of finance or general theory of economics. You're just starting off. You're not one of those Nobel Prize winners. You're not going to say anything really, really important. So be specific about what you're doing. Okay? In terms of abstract, so this is the first procedure that what I do as a referee. So when I get a paper, I read the title, okay, fine. And then I'll read the abstract. And as soon as I find the abstract not interesting, that paper is not going to get any chance in terms of other referees reading further on. So in abstract, this should have all the information about the paper. It should have it should have the objective, framework, why you're doing it, and the results. You shouldn't talk about other literature. You should just go straight into what this paper is all about. Okay? So this abstract should be the very short version of your paper. By the way, I hope the conference organizers link this presentation online somewhere so you guys can download and just see if you guys want to read it or something. So introduction is the most important part of the whole paper. The empirical part, the theoretical part, the literature review, those are all easy. Those takes time, but those are easy to do because you have the data, you have the model, those things are easy to work out. But introduction is the hardest part of the whole paper, and this is where you guys should be spending lots of time developing and spending time analyzing, rewriting 1,000 times over and over and over again. Okay? So introduction is essentially your paper. The rest, so when again, as a referee, I read the abstract and I read the introduction. If you don't pass the introduction, I'm not reading it. That's just a reject. Okay? So what do I want to see in the introduction? Is I want to see a very precise, very fact-finding introduction. I don't want to read about philosophy of economics or philosophy of finance or philosophy of management, philosophy of anything, right? A lot of times I see a paper that coming in, first 2 paragraphs is all about the world is very complicated. Yeah, who cares? We all know the world is complicated, right? So what we want to do is we want to think about what is your research question and how is that related to the data. That's all I want to read, right? And you shouldn't, I don't know really, this is a matter of preference, but I don't like to see quotes from somebody, things like to be or not to be, those things, philosophical quotes, it just, that's not me. I prefer not to see those and just get into the facts. But that's my preference. So after your objective, what you want to do, you want to state why you're doing it. Why is this interesting issue? So you kind of want to motivate why you're doing what you're doing. Okay? You could have very different types of motivation here. You could say the empirical results are different than previous results. The model is different than previous results. Or you could show why data does not fit the theory, so on and so forth. Can you, can you exit the full, because I want to show you this bottom part. At the back there, can you exit the full screen? Would that be possible? No one? It's okay. All right, so no one's there, that's fine. So here's the thing, one of the best papers I ever read was from one of my supervisors, Bob Lucas, who passed away last year. But his paper starts off with a graph, and he starts with a graph, and he says, Figure 1 shows this relationship, but the model contradicts this data. That was the first 2 sentences of a seminal paper by Bob Lucas. So he starts with a paper, with a figure. Thank you, this is good. Very good. So here's how I motivated one of my papers. Essentially, this paper was about running nonlinear regressions, okay? So when I see a paper, usually they just go into empirical models and say they're running this model, this regression, nonlinear regression. the way I motivated this non-linear regression was to show the data. And this data is essentially x-axis financial development of countries, how financial institution is developing over time by index. And then the y-axis is the foreign direct investment. So essentially what the data tells you is dots are all countries in the panel. So essentially you see the foreign direct investment is going down initially as the financial development is increasing, but at some point it's going up. Okay, so the literature, empirical literature, is divided on this type of issue. Some papers are saying it's going down. Some people are saying it's going up. The financial development, foreign direct investment. So what we wanted to show was, okay, this is the data. This is how we're going to motivate this relationship using this empirical framework. So in order to use this empirical framework, we motivate it by showing this data. Okay, so this is a justification for using this type of empirical framework. So it'll be really nice if I see a paper, some type of motivation, data motivation, or some kind of theoretical motivation of why what you're doing is interesting, and how do you justify that? Right. So essentially, what you want to tell the reader is, the roadmap of the methodology you're using. So if you state right away what type of empirical methodology you're using, they either know the methodology or they want to know the methodology, right? So you don't want to hide what you're doing to the end of the empirical section. You want to say that right away, what you're doing, and why is your methodology different than some other people. So you always want to compare and contrast what you're doing with others, okay? So again, state your contribution in introduction. It's always nice to see a paper that is very basic and straightforward, right? You don't want to overstate your results, but you want to state essentially what you're doing. So instead of writing long sentences and stuff, try writing a very short sentences that says, I do this, I contribute this, okay? That would be very good. And the last thing I want to talk about in introduction is this roadmap paragraph. You don't have to do this, you don't have to write this paper is organized as follows, because as a reader, you kind of know, just going over the paper, the sections you're working on. So this is not necessary unless you really want to say something in the roadmap. So I don't really care about whether you write this section and this paper is organized as such and such. Okay, there's a literature review. The way I see it in introduction, I see sometimes like 4 pages long introduction. You don't want to do that, right? Because the introduction should be short enough that to get referee's attention of what you're doing, or your supervisor, right? And if you do a whole bunch of literature review in the introduction, you're taking away the focus from your own paper and more focus on others. That's not what you want to do, right? You could do a brief introduction, brief literature review in your introduction, 1 or 2 sentences, how your paper is related to others. But that's it. Okay, you don't want to get into details of that. You can do that in different sections. And second of all, you don't want to say something negative about other papers. It could be that the other paper authors are your referees. So you don't want to say bad things about those things, those papers. You just want to say what they did, right? And you want to make sure you cite the references generously. You don't want to hide somebody else's work because they are too close to your work. Honesty in writing papers and submitting journals is really, really important. So I see it when I read, when I referee a lot of papers. I know what they're talking about. I know the papers they're not citing. When I see that, I don't really appreciate that type of academic work. So try to be honest and open and generous in terms of citation. All right, so here's the most common mistake a lot of PhD students make when they start writing, because they are so respectful for others. So they usually cite like Professor Krugman, Nobel Prize winner Krugman. Those things do not belong in academic journal. Okay? So just cite the paper, the name, and the year. That's it. Okay. All right, so here we go with the footnotes. So as a referee, I really don't like to see long footnotes. If there's long footnotes, that means it's important. If you think that's important to have a long footnotes, put it in the main text. Right? Don't hide in the footnotes. So don't make the footnotes really long. In the main section, here's some. So here's the rule about the main section. In terms of main section has empirical framework and empirical results. You know, this is an academic paper you're writing or thesis. It's not a novel. It's not a detective novel or murder series novel. You don't want to make the suspense to the end. A lot of people think it's you building it up, and then you give the final results at the end. But it's really annoying for readers to do this, to find out. Because you don't want to lose the interest of your referee. You want to make them to read your paper as soon as possible. So make your results right in front, okay? Don't do a whole bunch of preliminary works, a whole bunch of stuff before you get into the main results. It's very annoying. So, but descriptive statistics is okay if you're doing empirical works because you want to talk about your data set. That's fine. But if you do a whole bunch of little empirical work, robust checks and stuff like that before your main results, it's all unnecessary. Those could be going into the appendix. Later on if the referees ask for those. But get into your main results as soon as possible. And one other thing that bothers me a lot in refereeing a paper or editing a paper is having papers that have models, theoretical models. Okay, that has nothing to do with the empirical framework, empirical work. So a lot of PhD students think it's nice to have those mathematical equations and models in papers because they look good, but that's very annoying. If it's not a theoretical paper, don't even bother. Right? If you're doing an empirical work, just focus on the empirical analysis instead of trying to impress your colleagues or referees by putting theory in there that has nothing to do with the empirical structural parameters. Okay? And then do not write about very general stuff about empirical work. if you want to do a specific empirical regression, just write down a specific model instead of starting off with a general VAR model, how you get there. That no one is interested in, you're just wasting your space. All right, like I said, when you do the empirical work, get into your results as soon as possible, okay? So what I see a lot of students are doing is, they do a whole bunch of, let's say they're doing complicated empirical work. They start off a simple OLS, bivariate OLS, checking all the conditions. Those are good for PhD thesis in the beginning. But if you're sending it to a journal, you don't want to have more than 20 pages long. And if you want to do that, you got to get rid of all the stuff. And no one's interested in those simple regressions. Okay? So you want to make sure you get into the main results right away and leave those things in the appendix, or if the referees ask for that, you can send them later. But you want to make sure they like the main results first. All right. So tables and figures. So here's a little hint. Usually, again, the main message in this writing a paper or sending a journal is not to annoy referees. Okay? Not to annoy them. What annoys me a lot is when I see tables and figures, then I have to figure out what they actually mean. Okay? So if I see tables and figures, I want to see a clear title of what the relationship you're looking at. Okay? And instead of me figuring out what these numbers mean, and what the lines mean. So because you worked on this paper for so long, you think everybody should understand. But remember, the referees are seeing this paper for the first time, and they don't know that. So clearly mark, clearly explain what the tables and figures are doing. And make sure all the lines are clearly marked. Okay? All right, in terms of conclusion, let's see how much time I have. Okay, 11 minutes left. Very good. So conclusion again here. You don't want the conclusion to be really long, right? We have the, we all always want to explain ourselves again in conclusion, to thinking that people didn't understand what we are doing because we put so much effort writing this paper. So we want to repeat ourselves, explain again what we have done. If you're doing that, that means essentially you have not done a good job of explaining, right? Essentially your conclusion should be a very specific idea and the results and what you think you could improve, right? That's it. You don't have to repeat your introduction again. And here's a lot of papers too, which I don't really care that much, is that they write about a lot of implications, what this paper is about. That's okay. But I don't really like looking at reading what the possible your future research outlook should be, given this title, given your work. If that's the case, go and write it. Most of the times, when people write that is because they couldn't do it, right? Somehow they weren't able to write finding out or empirically or theoretically what you want to do. So this is a kind of limitation of what you're doing. Well, why would you want to say that if you want to sell your work to people, right? So essentially, I advise my students not to talk about what has not been done in this work, in your work. So I try to avoid that unless it's so obvious that you should be doing that. But then that kind of tells you your paper is not good enough, right? So I wouldn't do that. All right, so because this is a conference, I'm going to say a couple of words on presentation. And especially for PhD students, this is really relevant. Most of the conferences have 20-minute presentation. And it goes really fast, 20 minutes, right? And you have, again, thousands of ideas in your head. You want to present every little detail you have worked on for the last 2 years or a year. That's understandable. But people in the audience, they're seeing the first time, they're bored. They want to see the next presentation. They want to present their own work. They're not even thinking about your presentation, right? So your idea is just to go as basic as possible and present your main results as soon as possible, right? And this 20 minutes go by really, really fast, right? And then most of the time when I see PhD students is they talk about introduction forever. And they talk about other papers forever. By the time they finish the literature review, it's like 15 minutes gone, and you have 5 minutes to do your work. Why do you want to spend literature review the works that others have done? This is your presentation. So usually I tell my students, don't even bother doing literature review in a conference presentation. And again, some presentation they do their results before they're getting into the main part because they're afraid that they might run out of time, so they want to say their results right away. But essentially, that's kind of telling you you have not organized your presentation enough. You have to practice your presentation over and over and over and over again. You can't just wing it. It doesn't come by just like that. You really have to practice, right? If you have a 20-minute presentation, you should try to finish it in 15 minutes and say all the things you want, right? You can't just leave it until the last minute saying, oh, I might just get in this part if I have the time. You won't have the time. So practice, right? Practice all the time. Practice makes it perfect. So you have to practice. And if you're doing these results before your main presentation starts, essentially you have not done a good job. Okay. Again, make your presentation as simple as possible. Always remember, the audience, they are looking at your presentation for the first time. Unless they're really into this topic, they're not going to understand what you're saying. So make your results as simple as possible. Sometimes it's less is more, right? So don't boggle down into theoretical models in detail. Just go through the first order conditions of your theoretical model if that's the case. Go to the main empirical regression if that's the case. Okay? Don't start off the history of theory, history of empirical approach. Okay? And if you're in a seminar, conference is hard to do, but if you're in a seminar, listen to the audience topics, questions, write them down. Those comments from the audience, if you implement that in a paper, it makes a huge difference in terms of in terms of publication, in terms of referees, from my experience, if I see one or two sentences that I like, that I think sends a message, that's a good way of writing papers. And I like those papers. So the rejection and acceptance depends one or two sentences in a paper. And most of the time, those comments, those sentences are from the comments I usually get from the audience when I present my paper. So listen to the comments from the audience carefully and write them down as soon as the conference presentation is over. Okay? And here's another thing. You rush. This is the last comments I'm going to make about presentation. So you talk about a whole bunch of stuff, and you leave your results really late, so you rush. Right? And that's you lose the whole point of your presentation. Your final remarks are rushed because you talk about other stuff. Right? So, don't try to rush and don't try to go over your time limit. Most of the times, the audience really like it when you finish your presentation earlier. And there's nothing more annoying than some presenters going way over the time limit. So it's okay to finish a presentation early. Don't be afraid to finish a presentation 5 minutes early or 2 minutes early, because a lot of people will have a lot more questions to ask afterwards. Right, on that note, I'm done 7 minutes early. So again, this is the last little remarks I have, which is, try not to, if you're using some of the results from other papers, don't do copy and paste from other results. Write your own tables, interpret those tables, original tables in your own words, and make your own tables. I think that's it. This is my presentation, and I'm not so sure that this is a keynote speaking presentation, but I hope so this was intended for those PhD students and young researchers, not for old guys like me. So I hope you got something out of it. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gabriel.